Okay, hi everybody. My name is Tanya Poveda, and I'm a PhD candidate at York and X University in Toronto. And this is actually the subject of my PhD dissertation. It's entitled, I Didn't See Anyone Who Looked Like Me, Gender and Racial Representation in Board Gaming. And I'm so pleased and proud to be part of the Generation Analog conference this year. So first of all, for those folks who are maybe vaguely familiar with my work, I had an entire career working in corporations, mainly multinational publicly traded corporations, creating something called corporate dashboards. And essentially what that is a way for business leaders to look at the health of their sector and their businesses and do some key metric development, and they can actually look at it at a glance in a dashboard. So I did that work for a really long time. And this particular group of business leaders always shared with me that they really privilege numbers over stories. So really this particular presentation is really aimed at people who are in the board game industry, people who are watching the board game industry, as we all are, and kind of working with empiricism to share some of the trends that I'm observing. So one of the things that I did in 2018, I was actually down a completely different road with my PhD at that time. I was actually building VR and AI chatbots that you can interact with, and it was helping to work through issues around workplace toxicity and bullying and harassment specifically in corporate workspaces. And I actually decided to publish a small scale study in Analog Game Studies. They were gracious enough to publish it about the demographics of board game design and artwork trends, because I wanted to find out an answer to a question I was curious about as a board gamer. And I got some really good report on that initial study, but I also got a lot of backlash, a lot of negative feedback online. And I likened the experience chatting about it with my family to being attacked by hundreds of bees for weeks and weeks. So not a great experience, but I did during that same time get a geek mail from Andrew Hackard of Steve Jackson Games. And of course, I'm a long-time Munchkin fan, as my family will attest. We have so much Munchkin in this house. And I was absolutely thrilled. It was getting a note from a celebrity, and he gave me 500 geek gold. So I was completely over the moon about it. And he said, I read your article in Analog Game Studies. Thank you so much for laying out the numbers and urging us all to do better. I'm sharing this as widely as I can. And after I wiped away a bunch of tears, when I got this note, I wrote him an effusive fangirl note back saying, I love Munchkin so much. It was such a big deal to hear from him. Thank you so, so much. And I wrote, I will pay this forward. And I wanted to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Andrew Hackard, who was a very, very nice man. He definitely encouraged me to stay on this research. And I think without his note of encouragement and that of others in the industry, but specifically Andrew's, I would not have continued this research because I was feeling quite down when I got that note. And sadly, Andrew passed away in June of this year. So I really wanted to dedicate this research to him. So I decided to expand out my database from the 2018 study to 400, the top 400 BoardGameGeek games, and look at the demography of board game design as well as the artwork. And what I found was the labor pool of the top 400 games was comprised of mainly white men at 92.6% of the listed designers. So that's the big top line headline on that empirical building block. The next thing I did was I looked at the cover art and the racial and gender representation on the cover arts, and about 2,000 sentient figures, anything that was fauna or human representation I counted, and it was roughly 2,000 figures. And of those 2,000 figures, I determined that when gender could be identified, 76.8% represented as male, men, boys, and 23.2% were women, girls in terms of representation. And then I looked at racial diversity on the artwork, and what I found was only 17.5% was Black, Indigenous, person of color representation, BIPOC representation, and 82.5% were white presenting figures. So, a really thoughtful comment I got in a thread about my research a couple of weeks ago on BoardGameGeek, a game, put it really well. This was a comment an individual shared that the numbers are just a picture of the state of things, not how we got there. It's up to us to investigate the causes and the conversations about how and why it happened. And I thought that was a really interesting point. And I have looked at, basic population demography to kind of puzzle through, okay, why are these decisions being made? And if we look at the demographics of the US, which arguably, not arguably, is one of the largest consumer markets in the world, we've got a 40-60 split of Black, Indigenous persons of color making up 39.99% of the US population, and white non-Hispanics make up 60.1% of the US population. So it can't be that, the numbers are skewing because the sort of raw audience of maybe the largest consumer market in the world is this particular composition. We see it's a 40-60 split, so that can't be. And just incidentally, $12.5 trillion were spent last year by US consumers purchasing goods and services, both durable and non-durable. So the answer must be no on that question. So raw audience demographics, this would be the 101 that I would start with when I was building a dashboard. Then someone rightly pointed out on the forum, this BoardGameGeek thread, that I think it's important to note that board games are not completely US centered, and that's a fair point. Board games are in fact a global phenomenon, and I agree with this person's sentiment, and that he encouraged me to consider a much wider data set to reach valid conclusions. He was really questioning my conclusions. So let's broaden out that frame and look at the globe. So it's an 80-20 split. Black, Indigenous persons of color make up 80% of the world's population and are rightly called people of the global majority, which is fast overtaking BIPOC as a way of describing Black, Indigenous persons of color. They are the people of the global majority. That is a empirically valid, not a moniker. So that can't be it either. The sort of more expansive global frame sort of calls into question the kind of decision-making we see in the artwork. So that is something we can put to one side. And then incidentally, both the US and Canada have more women than men. The US has 50.5% women making up the population, and 50.4% in Canada are women, identifying as women. So that can't be either. So we know, taking this all in all, these are not representative numbers. They're not equitable numbers. They don't map to population, certainly for these two economies. And then when we delve into the city frameworks, looking at cities as demographic areas, the New York City is actually one of the largest consumer hubs in the world, and 57.27% of New York City is BIPOC, and 42.73% of New York City is white. And we can also see in Los Angeles, it's almost a 50-50 split at 47.28% BIPOC in LA. So that can't be it either. These two big consumer hubs, these are not the reasons why, publishers are making these decisions, especially in these markets. Similarly in Canada, 50-50 split, where I am right now in Toronto, BIPOC makes up 49.9%. And in Vancouver, interestingly, 67.3% of the population in Vancouver is BIPOC, which is large. So again, no, these two consumer hubs in Canada, that can't be the reason these decisions are being made. And so the pivot is always this, well, maybe board gaming doesn't appeal to non-white audiences or certain religions or sexes as much. And this is a thing we hear often. And so, and similarly, a much less kind or articulate comment, some of us who simply do not have that gene, and this is an individual speaking, like I said earlier, I know people who have no interest in gaming, the statement that everybody likes or wants to game is false. Okay, so, and I actually asked this individual, why do you think that board gaming then is a niche hobby? And he wrote numbers in reply. And what I think is interesting about that is if you look at some of the numbers, and I did an audit of a lot of the different publisher demographic profiles and found that, this is an example from Stonemaier Games, their poll of their audience was 81.1% male and 99% male in the case of Paxisms, who did a survey in 2016. So, that actually validates this individual's pushback that, perhaps not all women, non-binary, LGBTQ, or BIPOC people are interested in games. And from those numbers, you would think that that was true. But then let's look at video game demography. And we can see that 46% of all digital gamers are women in the US, and 50% of all digital gamers and women are Canada. And we see this really healthy participation rate in Black Americans and Hispanic Americans based on Pew Research about digital play. So that's not true then, right? Certainly in video games, we see a really healthy demographic mix. Why is board gaming so niche? And we see here a possible clue where Jesper Duell talked about the hardcore valley. Games started out as being universal, being very, everyone was interested in playing the games. And then they plunged into the hardcore valley where it's gate-kept, held in the hands of a very small demographic group. And then slowly and surely, video games crawled out of that hardcore valley into a much more universality of interest. So I would argue that perhaps board games, let's see, are in that hardcore valley. Nonetheless, I conducted an online survey to really delve into diversity in this board gaming hobby and got 320 participants. This was in late 2020. I promoted it on Twitter, BGG, and Reddit. And what I found was 60% of the sample identified as women. That includes trans women. 74.9% identified as white. 20.4% identified as BIPOC, and a little over half at 52.8% identified as LGBTQ plus, And what I also saw from the data is that the participants of this survey were very avid gamers at 70.7%, gaming at least board gaming against at least weekly. And 53.5% gamed for more than 11 years, so more than half. So by any stretch of the imagination, these folks would definitely pass the nerd cred checks that we often encounter. And so what is really interesting, and again, keeping in mind that the majority of the sample was white, that 81.5% said they wish publishers would publish more games designed by women designers. And 81.7% said they wish publishers would publish more games designed by BIPOC designers. So again, we're thinking about the diversity of the sample and who was filling this out, their avid participation in board gaming. We got 82.8% who wished publishers would ensure board game artwork had more equitable gender representation. And 84.9% wished publishers would ensure their board game artwork had more equitable racial representation. And, again, a big top line finding was 84.9% said positive representation was linked to greater enjoyment of a game. And, big bottom line results here in terms of delimitation is you've got people really having an appetite at 51.6% more likely to play a game designed by a BIPOC designer and 56.9% more likely to purchase a game by a BIPOC designer. And again, similar findings with women designers, 49.7% said more likely to play a game and 54.9% more likely to purchase a game by a woman designer. And we see some analogs out there in other cultural pursuits, other cultural sectors. It's estimated that $32.2 million, if you spend $159 million making a film, and this was pre-pandemic box office, you would lose $32.2 million in that opening weekend if your film lacked authentically inclusive representation. And what that means is no stereotypes, positive representation. You're going to lose money if you don't have that in the mix, and you will lose 80% of your film's budget over time. So it's a real warning to publishers. And what is also really interesting about my study is I found that a lot of people commented along these lines. Here's one quote from one of the people who filled out the study. As a white person, I am overjoyed when the entire cast of a game is BIPOC. So that gives lie to the idea that publishers must include white representation in games or risk that audience being alienated. So overall, I would say that this is sort of a hey industry moment where if I were building you a dashboard, there'd be a blinking red light on your console saying there's something off, there's something wrong here. Your audience is telling you something that you're not currently doing, and you need to fix that. And so lastly, we have to ask ourselves why these decisions are consistently made, why we see this empirical sweep of whiteness and maleness in artwork and in the labor pool of game design, when it's not clearly a financial nor population move. And the last comment I'm going to share is from a BoardGameGeek thread where, and I love the way this was put, representation absolutely matters. Although it would be easy to say it's incumbent upon all of us to continue to recognize our role in serving as catalysts for change. But it might be even more impactful for those with privilege to recognize and accept the unquestionable ability to accelerate or impede progress. And I'm calling upon industry leaders to change their thinking as they create these games. And thanks so much for listening to me. Here's how you get in touch with me, and I really appreciate your time and attention.